In this video, we're going to look at how much money I've spent in my garden in a whole year. What did I buy? Where did I buy it from? And when in the year did I buy it? So I've been gardening in this garden for over 10 years now, and last year was a typical year. It's an established garden and there was no big budget spent on new renovations in the garden, so the money I spent last year is pretty much a typical year, if we can have such thing as a typical year in the garden. So I bought things including pots, compost, plants and seeds, and we're going to look at how much I spent on all those things and more. But before we get to that part of the video, right at the start of last year, I asked people to guess how much money I would spend in the garden. How much does it cost to create and maintain an exotic garden in a year? And they left a comment on YouTube, and we had various guesses from under £200 up to £500, up to £1,000, up to £2,000 or £2,000 and more. So what do you think I spent in my garden last year? Now, before we actually look at how much money I spent, there are some things that I didn't include in the list. And these things are heating and lighting for the greenhouse, the water bill for all the watering as well, because I couldn't 100% differentiate between that spend and spend, on the house as well. So we left them out. Anything in terms of renovations on the house, didn't include those, and any house plants. So the plants were bought, but there were house plants, and anything associated with house plants have not been included in this summary. What we've got here is everything I spent that went into my outdoor space that you'd include as part of the garden. So yes, this is plants. This is any projects like paths in the garden. This would be garden furniture, anything like that, tools as well. But like I said, it's an established garden and there weren't many big purchases in the year, but there was a couple and we'll go through them right now. We're going to go through on a month by month basis to say how much I spent each month, what I spent it on, where I bought that, did I buy it online, did I buy it in person, and which specific places did I actually make the purchases from, and what can we tell from this information? What can we summarize from what I bought, and is this typical of everybody or just in my case, my niche of having an exotic garden? We'll go through all that information step by step, looking at some graphs, looking at some data, and then we'll have a conclusion at the end. So now let's look at when I actually spent the money on the garden. And as you can see from the start of the year, nothing was spent in January. Into February, then we got nearly 7% of the spend. March, hardly anything at all, and basically the first few months of the year were just a little bit of buying things, getting ready for the year ahead. But as we move through spring into early summer, that's when obviously purchases were made for the garden in terms of plants, compost, pots and other things. So April, May and June, there was a substantial amount of money spent, about a third of the total yearly budget in those 3 months. We came to July, hardly any money spent in July because pretty much everything was ready from the purchases we had earlier in the year. And then August, and we'll see why it was a big purchase in August, why 30% or a third of the money again was just spent in 1 month. And then it came to a halt. We had nothing spent in September or October, and that is because I'd bought everything I needed for the garden to enjoy it for that year. There was nothing else that I needed to buy, and we weren't doing any other projects for the year. So that is why there was nothing spent in summer and early autumn. As we moved into November, there was a little bit of spend, and then quite surprisingly, we spent a fifth of the whole yearly budget in December, and we'll have a look at what I bought in a second. So this is what I bought. I bought fertilizer, furniture, hosepipe, plants, pots, seeds, growing media and other. So let me just quickly talk about what I mean by a few of these categories. Obviously fertilizer is pretty obvious, that's plant food, nutrition added for my plants to the garden and pots.
Furniture, well, this is outdoor furniture used to obviously sit on and enjoy being outside. Hose pipes are hose pipes. Plants, this is any plants I bought, whether permanent plantings or annual bedding plants. Pots, this includes large pots for the garden, but generally this money was spent on plant pots for potting on, seed trays and things like that. Seeds, this is buying seeds from seed companies. Others include anything that doesn't really fit into these other categories and is minimal. As you can see, 2.6 of my entire budget was spent on other things. And growing media. Growing media is anything from compost, manure, soil, any growing sand, gravel, things that went into growing mix, but not things like gravel for decorative purposes, for paths or anything like that. This is strictly for actually using in potting, compost or in borders. And as you can see, this is the biggest percentage out of everything that's spent in the garden was on growing media. And then after growing media, it was furniture. But this furniture spend was a one-off spend. One thing was bought, and that was for the open garden days, needed more seating areas, so I bought some more seating for the garden. And after this, the next two biggest percentage spends were on pots and plants, pretty even at 10 and 11%. I bought lots of pots this year because I needed to have lots of plants for the open days. That's one thing, but also growing lots of things from seed meant that things had to be potted into trays and then into larger pots, and then larger pots still in a lot of cases before then planting out in their final locations. So a bit like veg growing annuals for the decorative purposes for the tropical exotic look in the garden meant I did have the need for lots of pots. And then plants as well. These plants were mainly annual plants to bulk out the garden for summer colour, as well as some permanent plants in the garden, but most of this spend were on annual plants. I needed some new house pipes, so I got some of that, and obviously feeding these plants is important, so that's why there was some spend on fertiliser. But if we look at this as a whole, as you can see, majority of money was spent on furniture and growing media, and then quite a lot, just 10% each, on plants and pots, and seeds nearly as much as on plants. So I've spent quite a lot of money on seeds, or I have spent not much money on plants, whichever way you look at it. Now let's look where I actually made my purchases, and some of these might surprise you or they might not at all. And as you can see, the biggest company that I used was Amazon. Obviously I bought lots of things online, and Amazon was one of the main companies I spent my money online. And these weren't for plants or necessarily seeds. This was basically for some growing media, some compost, some plant pots. But the biggest thing that I bought on Amazon, because I needed it quickly, was that garden furniture. So a big portion of my spend on that garden furniture for the year, bought it from Amazon, and that's why my biggest spend was on Amazon. After that, we've got Dandy's, and Dandy's is a place where you can buy gravel and soil manure in bulk bags and loose, and that's where I got pretty much all my growing media from this year for the garden. Less so for pots, for seedling trays, but for actually in the garden, that's where I got pretty much all my compost and manure from. So over 25% of all my spend was just from Dandy's last year. After that, we can see we've got money from garden centres. So these are Cargate Garden Centre, Spring Green Garden Centre and Hamptons. These are three local garden centres to me where I can go in person, look at the plants and buy them. And these were basically all bedding plants. Other accessory things were bought as well from them, a bit of fertiliser and things, but pretty much these were the three places that I went and bought plants in person. We can see most of my seed spend, because of 6.9% bought seeds, but 6.7 of that 6.9 were actually from Chiltern seeds, or Chiltern as I spelt it on this pie chart by mistake, and you can see that is quite a lot of money from one company just on seeds. But I grew so much from seed last year, most of it survived into good plants that I grew for annual colour, but also some permanent plantings as well. And then after that, a little bit of money was spent in wicks. Again, that was just on potting compost where I needed it quickly. So, and then we had to spend at other places as well, but not really of any high percentage. So quickly looking at this, we can see I spent most on Amazon, most at Dandy's, and then in garden centres in person. And then from this, we can see how much I've actually spent in person and how much I've spent online. Now, this may or may not surprise you again. And we can see that in person, so actually going out to a garden centre, a nursery, a DIY store, etc., I spent 31.8% of my yearly money for the garden in person. And that left 68.2% for online purchases. So basically just over 2/3 of the spend in the whole year was online purchases.
If you're finding this video interesting, informative, educational, then please click that subscribe button, give it a like, drop a comment below, and we can talk about how much money you spend on your garden and how much you think I'll spend on my garden next year.
Now let's look at the spend on a day-by-day basis as we race through the year, starting in January, where the most spend was on seeds and then compost overtook seeds as we move through February into March. Pots, fertiliser was spent, plants were bought in April as well and May, and fertiliser and hose pipes, more pots, more plants in June as we move into midsummer, and then quickly furniture comes to the top, and then we get to August and it pauses, and September we pause because I bought nothing in those months. Then we move into October, we can see compost spend takes the lead, and by the end of the year we have compost winning the battle of the most spent. Now let's have a look in pounds and pence how much I actually spent as we go through the year month by month. And as we can see, March and November we didn't spend much. July we spent about £50, February close to £100, and then April about £125, £150 in June, £200 nearly in May, and then in December we spent nearly £300, so more than every other month apart from August, where we spent the most money, almost £400. So you can see it wasn't even the spend throughout the year. It went up and down, but the big months were August and December where most of the money was spent. But how much is this in total?
So as you can see, most of my money, apart from the garden furniture, didn't go on seeds, didn't go on plants, which most people I think would expect the money to go on. It actually went on compost and soil. And I think this is because obviously I grew lots of plants from seed, so lots of compost was needed for those. And also I like to put on compost manure in the garden to mulch plants and to add that nutrition back into the garden. And why do we do this? Well, I think this is the most important thing you can do to sustain a good healthy garden, is look after the soil, keep on top of the nutrients, keep adding organic matter, raising levels a little bit as well where possible for that drainage, for that soil structure. And I think spending the money on the soil, on the compost, is more important than actually buying new plants. If you're spending, say, £50 on a beautiful specimen plant, I'd expect to spend at least that again in ground preparation for the area, or if you're potting on in pots and compost as well. So that's why I spent so much of my money on that compost, on that growing media. And I think that is going to be the same year after year. And in fact, over the years, I think we'll see the amount of plants I've bought decline, and more plants grown from seed or harvested and cuttings made myself to propagate in the garden. So that soil and garden tools and things like that will become higher, and actually buying plants and even buying some seeds will become lower over time. And for those that know my garden, it's a long narrow garden, and it's in a semi-rural area. It's not a huge space, so I don't need to be buying absolutely loads of things. But obviously, if I'm doing a new project, like making a new path, making a jungle hut, something like that in the garden, that is quite an initial outlay, and that would offset all the cost of plants, seeds and compost in that year if I was doing a big project like that. But last year, like I said, there was no big projects. Everything were just small purchases apart from a bit of garden furniture. So you can see how the soil and then smaller scale, the plants and the pots were the main purchases throughout the year, and most of these purchases actually in terms of value were online rather than in person. But when it comes down to those plant purchases, most of them were in person in this particular year. So what can you take away from this? Well, like I said, soil is really important, and that's why I keep making sure the nutrition is there. And also, you don't have to spend over £1,000 like I have. You can spend whatever you can afford. If you've got much bigger land and you've got much bigger budget, obviously you'll spend lots more. If you're growing from things from seeds that you collected yourself in your soil and you hardly buy any sort of fertilizer or anything, your costs will be absolutely minuscule. And obviously different types of plants need different resources. My plants do need, potting on a lot in spring. The annuals that grow in the garden in summer start off as seeds, then potting onto bigger plants, and that does add the cost there. And the cost that we didn't talk about, the heating and lighting costs of the greenhouse have increased as well over the years, and that will be a decent proportion of the budget spent in the garden, but not accounted for in this video. So the grand total, after all is said and done, spent in the garden is
£1,312.19. We are close. Did you guess that much? Do you think it'd be a lot less? Do you think it'd be a lot more? For me, actually, that was pretty much an average year. It's something I can afford to spend that much money. It's my main hobby and passion, and it brings a lot of pleasure to my family and friends and everybody who visits the garden. And it's something obviously I like to maintain. I make my YouTube videos regarding exotic gardening, so I think it's well worth spending that money on my garden. Thank you for watching this edition of Exotic Gardening UK. Join me next week. We'll be doing more in the garden.